In 1998, the now famous hockey stick graph appeared and changed not just the future, but history, your lifestyle, your child's education, your wealth, free speech, your health, and your security. None for the better. The hockey stick graph was produced by a young researcher who later became Dr. Mann. So this is the hockey stick that is responsible for so much. It shows a gradual decline in temperature over the last 1,000 years. Then in the 20th century, a sharp uptake, a sharp increase in temperature. This, of course, they plot against CO2, and hence the hockey stick name is obvious. The very first point to make about this graph is it shows about 1,000 years on continual cooling, and had the CO2 not come along, according to the alarmist, we'd have just carried on getting colder and colder. So how did the scientists come up with this hockey stick graph? A record showing a gradual decline in temperatures over the last 1,000 years, a record showing no medieval warm period, no little ice age, just a pretty level constant drop-off in temperatures until mankind started chilling in carbon dioxide, and then whack, up we came. Well, they used tree rings. They considered tree rings to be a proxy for the actual temperatures when they grew. And so by examining tree rings in certain ways, they could come up with the temperature of the day. Mann's team was not the only team doing this sort of work. In the UK, a scientist called Keith Briffa was doing this work and doing it independently from Mann. So let's take a look at Briffa's graph and just see how it compares to the Mann graph. Well, here it is, and wow, what a difference. No gradual cooling here over the 1,000 years. No little ice age, really, and no medieval warming period, though. Looking here at the more recent data, there is the 1930s warming period here, and that, of course, is when we had the Dust Bowl in America and huge migration from the land. But after that, in sharp contrast to the hockey stick, we had falling temperatures. Well, at least that sort of coincides with all the ice age coming scale in the 70s, and it ended in the 90s with the temperature cooler than at any time for the last 600 years. Both the Mann and Briffa works were published in Nature. With such a clash of conclusions, one would have to, in any normal world, start examining the data, the method, but certainly not just accept one or the other. It would normally be a case of back to the drawing board, just what's gone wrong here. Now, based on Greenland ice records, the temperature of the past 1,000 years did show a medieval warming period and did show a little ice age. And of course, none of the two graphs in any way remotely resemble this record. So while that was being pondered, out of the blue came another study that simply knocked these out of the way. The remains of a black spruce forest 130 kilometers north of the current tree line in Canada and inside the Arctic Circle was an interesting development, because that forest dated 1000 BC to 1600 AD. Over 2,500 years it was there. The forest had a major fire and had been burnt down, but couldn't regrow because the climate had become too cold. We'd now entered the Little Ice Age. And given that the methods used to date this were well-established scientific ones, not experimental ones like the tree ring data being used in this study, it was a big blow. Clearly, the weather had been much warmer during this period than it is now, and the 130 kilometers or 80 miles equates to about an average of 1 degree centigrade in global warming. So we knew at that time the temperatures were much higher than they are today. This had to be dealt with. It was a major and significant challenge to the entire tree ring data exercise. And it was dealt with. It was buried. What was to shock me was that this year I personally put this problem to an expert in the field, a man who'd written a book on the history of climate change. And his answer was it must have been caused by a variation in the jet stream. But jet stream changes by day to day or week to week. It doesn't sit there for 2,500 years. It was a ridiculous answer. So returning to our mystery of which way would this go, would we take the Briffa model or the man model? Well, this is where the IPCC enter the game. Inside the UN IPCC organization, those who write the summary for policymakers are politicians, not scientists. And 2 years before the report even was going to be produced, they had a favourite. They favoured the man model. A leaked email here from the coordinating lead author explains the problem they had. The different versions of the history, Briffa and man, contradicted each other. But the policymakers favour one over the other. The politicians favour one over the other. This is not science. This is choosing by an agenda. Evidence of this is in the last phrase here. Dilutes the message rather significantly. Well, science is not about giving a message. It's about finding the truth. And in this email, Keith Briffa, who's now deceased unfortunately, is actually very worried about what's happening and ignoring the discrepancies. So there is pressure here to present a nice tidy story as regards the apparent unprecedented warming in 1,000 years or more in the proxy data. In other words, there's pressure to be alarmist. The tree ring method actually had a discrepancy when you compared the tree ring method to the actual measured temperatures in the 20th century. And this is what he's referring to when he says contains some unexpected changes in response to that do not match the recent warming. And in the follow-up email, Briffa states, I believe that the recent warmth was probably matched about 1,000 years ago. In other words, he's saying the medieval warm period was at least the same as today. And then he further adds, I do not believe that the global mean annual temperatures have simply cooled progressively over thousands of years, as Mike appears to, and I contend that there is some strong evidence for major changes in climate over the Holocene. Mike, by the way, is Michael Mann. In response, Michael Mann responds, basically, that we cannot undermine the faith in the record, and to actually allow Briffa data in would do that. This is not science. With words like faith, it's more like a religious belief. In science, skepticism is welcomed. In science, to even be proven wrong is welcome because you learn more. Here, Michael Mann is incredibly saying that we can't allow Keith's theories in because something else then may be responsible. And of course he is right, because as we know from recent work, it's the sun that's the other factor. But he is assuming there's no other factor. We can't even allow that to be considered. Again, not science. But of course the politicians had their way, and Briffa's data was buried. Briffa's decline at the end here was just dropped. Basically, the last 33 years, the Briffa data showing the decline in temperatures was simply eliminated. And the hockey stick was born. A huge industry in climate alarmism. A later inquiry into this admitted that the decline had been hidden, admitted everything that I've claimed here, and gave a slap on the wrist to the participants. The decline had been hidden. Briffa's decline here simply disappeared. No science, just an agenda. Subsequent to all this, the climate alarmists went back in history and changed the temperature data. The 1930s was the hottest decade of the 20th century, but that's no longer the case. Because of this alarmism, many parts of your lifestyle today are being totally changed, from vehicles and transport to home heating, and in many other ways as well. Today, children in schools are being scared and miseducated with alarmism that is simply not true. Almost brainwashing would be the term. In the UK today, you are already paying about 40% more for your power than you need to. All sorts of energy costs are increasing because of the green policies imposed by alarmism. And by the way, free speech? Forget it. Even my videos like this are shadow banned or taken off social media. Free speech basically is a thing of the past, and yet it is fundamental, absolutely fundamental to all science. Aside from old people who can't sometimes afford to even heat their home, there is also the issue of our children's mental health, with what they're being told about the end of the world being nigh. Even the security of your power supply is now in danger, with really absurd plans, for example by Boris Johnson, which do not take into account the real world whatsoever, for which we're going to pay a very high price.